Aidan and Grace had always been adventurers at heart. When they came across the secluded Airbnb listing, tucked away in the hills, far from the bustle of the city, they thought it would be the perfect getaway. It was exactly what they were looking for, a quiet, peaceful retreat to disconnect from their busy lives. The house, an old Victorian-style cottage, was advertised as remote, tranquil, and full of character. It seemed like an idyllic escape, and they couldn't resist booking it for the weekend. When they arrived, the house greeted them with an eerie charm. The exterior was a little weathered, with creeping ivy snaking up the walls and the front door slightly ajar as though waiting for them. It wasn't exactly what they had expected, but the remoteness of it felt strangely comforting. The property was surrounded by thick woods, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the whispering of the wind through the trees. The hosts were kind but brief in their introduction, leaving them to their own devices after handing over the key. "You'll love it here," the host said with a strange smile. "Enjoy your stay. But whatever you do, don't go into the back room upstairs." Aidan and Grace laughed it off as a quirky warning, but curiosity lingered in their minds. What was it about the back room that seemed to make the host so uneasy? They decided to explore the house after settling in. It was large and rambling, with high ceilings, creaking floorboards, and a musty smell that seemed to cling to every corner. The downstairs rooms were filled with dusty old furniture, while the upper floors appeared untouched for decades. There were antique mirrors on the walls, the kind with tarnished gold frames, and old portraits that seemed to watch them as they moved. The upstairs hallway stretched long and narrow, with 4 doors leading off it. Grace opened the first door to find a bedroom, perfectly ordinary, save for the unsettling feeling that the room had never been truly lived in. The second door revealed a bathroom, and the third was a small storage room. But the fourth door, the one at the end of the hall, was locked. Grace tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She gave Aidan a teasing glance, the kind that hinted at her desire to find out what was behind it. "I bet the 'don't go into the back room' thing is just for dramatic effect," she said with a grin. Aidan shrugged, sensing her curiosity. "Why not? Let's find out." He turned the knob again, but it was futile. The door remained stubbornly shut. That night, after a quiet dinner and a glass of wine, the couple sat on the couch, relaxing in the living room. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of wood settling. But as the evening deepened into night, they heard it, a soft, low, almost imperceptible sound coming from upstairs. It was faint at first, but as they listened, it became unmistakable. A gentle breathing, not like the wind, but more rhythmic, like someone or something inhaling and exhaling in the darkness. Aidan stood up. "Did you hear that?" Grace nodded slowly, her gaze flicking to the staircase. "Yeah, it sounds like breathing." Aidan felt his heart rate pick up. He thought it could just be an old house settling or perhaps the wind playing tricks. But something in the back of his mind made him uneasy. "Let's go check it out," Grace suggested, her voice barely a whisper. They crept up the stairs, moving cautiously through the dim hallway. The breathing sound grew louder, and it seemed to be coming from the locked door at the end of the hallway. Without speaking, Aidan grabbed the old brass key that was hanging on the wall near the stairs. It felt unnaturally cold in his hand as he walked toward the door. As the key slid into the lock, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The door clicked open with a low groan. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. They stepped into the room, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath them. But the room, it wasn't empty. It was more like a void. There were no windows, no furniture, no signs of life at all. The walls were bare except for strange, intricate symbols etched deeply into the wood. They were unfamiliar, unsettling, almost alien in nature. The air was thick, and the strange breathing sound continued, growing louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves, as if the room was alive. Grace reached out to touch the wall, her fingers brushing against the cold wood. As soon as she made contact, the breathing stopped. Aiden turned to her. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice shaky. But before she could answer, the door slammed shut behind them. They both jumped, spinning around in shock. The room, which had seemed so empty only moments before, now felt suffocating. A heavy pressure seemed to push down on them from all sides. They tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room began to feel smaller, as if the walls were closing in. The air grew colder, and they could see their breath misting in front of them. In the flickering light from the hallway, they noticed something that hadn't been there before, a pair of glowing eyes, faint and distant, watching them from the far corner of the room. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. "Aiden, I don't think we're alone in here." Suddenly, the symbols on the walls shifted, as though they were alive. They twisted and reformed, forming images that seemed to look directly at them. One of the symbols began to glow, casting an eerie light across the room. It was as if the room itself was alive, watching them, studying them, and drawing them closer. Aiden stepped back, his hand gripping Grace's arm tightly. "We need to get out. Now." They tried again to open the door, but it was as though something was holding it shut from the other side. The breathing sound returned, this time louder and more insistent. It felt as if someone, was coming closer, waiting for the moment when they would be trapped forever. Panic gripped them both, and they screamed for help, but no one could hear them. The house, once silent, now felt like a living nightmare. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, as if the very air was alive with a presence that was not their own. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door flung open. They stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. The air in the house felt normal again, still, heavy, but safe. The symbols on the walls were gone, as though they had never been there. But when they tried to leave, they realized something worse. There was no sign of the key. It had vanished. They spent the rest of the night terrified, unable to sleep, staring at the door as if expecting it to open on its own. By morning, the house was quiet, as though the night's horrors had been forgotten, but neither of them could forget what they had experienced. They left the Airbnb early the next day, not even bothering to inform the hosts. As they drove away, they saw the house in the rearview mirror, ordinary, normal, as if nothing had happened. But neither Aiden nor Grace could shake the feeling that the room was still watching them, and that they would never be free of it. The room that sees you, waits for you, and claims you, forever. The night shift at Riverside Hospital was always the quietest. It was just past midnight when Charlie and his partner, Emily, received their first call of the evening. They were used to the late hours and the routine, a few minor injuries, the occasional emergency, and the normal hum of the hospital. But tonight, something was different. "Riverside Ambulance, go ahead," Charlie answered, glancing at the dashboard. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, a voice came through, soft and unsteady. "Help. Please, we're dying. Help us." Charlie frowned. The voice sounded strained, and there was an eerie quality to it, like it was coming from a long distance. "Can you give us your location?" he asked, trying to remain calm. There was a crackling sound, and then a whisper, "The old chapel, on Rose Hill." Charlie turned to Emily, his brow furrowing. "Did you hear that? The old chapel?" Emily nodded, looking just as confused. The chapel on Rose Hill had been abandoned for years. The place was a ghost story in the town, a crumbling, forgotten structure that no one dared to visit. "We're on our way," Charlie said, trying to push aside the chill creeping up his spine. The ambulance sped through the darkened streets, the neon lights of the hospital fading in the rearview mirror. The further they drove, the more the world around them seemed to change. The streets grew quieter, the houses spaced farther apart. The trees lining the road swayed ominously, their branches scratching at the windows like fingers. When they reached Rose Hill, the chapel stood as a shadow against the dark sky. It looked just as abandoned as Charlie remembered, its stained glass windows shattered, the front door hanging loosely on its hinges. The headlights of the ambulance illuminated the empty steps leading up to the church, but no one was there. "Where are they?" Emily muttered, stepping out of the ambulance. Charlie followed, scanning the area. There were no signs of life, no footprints in the dust, nothing that indicated anyone had been there recently. "Hello?" Charlie called, his voice echoing in the empty air. No response. As they walked closer to the chapel, Charlie felt a sudden drop in temperature. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as if the place itself was holding its breath. A sound broke the silence, a faint, eerie whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Charlie's heart began to race. Emily glanced nervously at him, her eyes wide with unease. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Before Charlie could respond, something moved in the corner of his vision, a shadow darting just inside the chapel. He spun around, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. "Emily," he said, voice tight with worry. "I think we need to go back." But as he turned to head back to the ambulance, something stopped him, a soft tapping noise, like a knock on a door. But there were no doors here, just the crumbling ruins of the old chapel. The sound came again, louder this time, from the back of the building. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Charlie didn't need to answer. They both followed the sound, walking carefully around the back of the chapel, their flashlights flickering in the darkness. They reached the rear of the building and found a set of narrow stairs leading down into what appeared to be a small basement. The door to the basement was ajar, and the tapping sound came from within. Charlie's hand hovered over his radio. "Riverside, do you copy?" he said, but there was only static in response. "What the hell is going on?" Emily whispered, fear creeping into her voice. They descended into the basement, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. As their flashlights swept across the room, they saw nothing at first. But then, in the far corner, they spotted something that made their blood run cold. A figure, hunched and cloaked in shadows, sat with its back to them. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge their presence. But the whispers, they were coming from the figure now. "Please. Help," the voice croaked, distorted and faint. Charlie's heart pounded in his chest. "Is that," he began, but Emily interrupted him. "No," she whispered, grabbing his arm. "No, that's not possible." The figure turned slowly, and Charlie's breath caught in his throat. It was a man, his skin pale and ashen, his eyes wide and vacant, staring through them as if they weren't even there. But the worst part wasn't his appearance. It was the way he seemed to fade in and out of existence, like a ghost caught between worlds. The man's mouth moved again, and this time, his voice was clearer, though still faint. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "They'll come for you." They always do. A chill ran down Charlie's spine. Who? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's lips curled into a pained smile. The ones who never left. With a sudden burst of energy, the figure lurched forward, but Charlie and Emily both stumbled back in fear. The man's form flickered, and before they could react, he vanished into the darkness, leaving only a lingering, oppressive silence. "What the hell is going on?" Emily said, her voice shaky. "We need to get out of here." Charlie didn't need to be told twice. They rushed back to the ambulance, the weight of the encounter pressing on them with each step. When they reached the vehicle, Charlie immediately grabbed the radio again, but this time, there was no static. Only silence. The ambulance started up, and they drove back toward Riverside Hospital, but something felt off. The streets, which had once felt familiar, now seemed foreign. The lights of the town were distant, as if a world itself was slipping away. When they arrived at the hospital, everything appeared normal at first, until they pulled into the parking lot and saw a figure standing by the entrance. It was the same man, the ghostly figure from the chapel. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, hundreds of shadowy figures stood, their eyes hollow and their faces distorted by an unseen pain. Charlie slammed the ambulance into reverse, but as he did, he noticed something even worse. He could still hear the whispers. They were coming from inside the ambulance. "You shouldn't have come," the voice echoed, the same voice that had spoken from the figure in the basement. And then, with a final, sickening realization, Charlie understood. The man at the chapel hadn't been the only one who had died there. They all had. And they were coming back for them. It was a cold autumn afternoon when Laura, an experienced hiker, decided to venture into the remote pine grove forest. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows between the trees, but the air still held the last warmth of the day. Laura had heard rumors about the forest, the kind of rumors that stir curiosity but also a little unease. Whispers of a strange, haunting sound emanating from the depths of the woods, of hikers who had gone missing, and of a chilling cry that echoed through the trees at night. Laura, always eager for a new adventure, dismissed the rumors as local folklore. She had hiked through countless forests and mountains, each with its own stories, but nothing could ever compare to the thrill of the wild. She brushed off the warnings of the locals as she made her way along the winding trail, the path thick with fallen leaves and the scent of damp earth. The sounds of the outside world quickly faded away, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the branches and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. However, as she ventured deeper into Pine Grove, something felt off. The usual comforting sounds of the forest, the chirp of birds, the rustling of leaves, were absent. The silence was unnerving, broken only by her own footsteps. She stopped for a moment, adjusting her backpack, and heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A soft whimper. Laura paused, turning her head toward the noise. She strained her ears, trying to locate its source. At first, she thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or some small creature, but as the sound grew clearer, it was unmistakable. It was the cry of a baby. Her heart skipped a beat. A baby? Out here? In the middle of nowhere? Laura's curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to investigate. She followed the sound, her steps quickening as the cry grew louder and more desperate. The sound seemed to come from deeper in the forest, where the trees were thick and the path less clear. The further she went, the more the cry seemed to echo, bouncing off the trees and sending shivers down her spine. It was high-pitched and pitiful, the kind of cry that no one could ignore. It sounded so real, so human, that Laura couldn't believe it. Who could have left a baby out here in the woods? Why would anyone bring a child to such a desolate place? Her heart raced, and a creeping sense of dread began to settle over her. But she couldn't turn back, not yet. She had to find out where the sound was coming from. The woods around her seemed to grow darker, and the trees grew more twisted, their branches like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. As she pressed forward, the air grew colder, and the cries became louder, almost frantic. Laura stumbled over roots and rocks, the underbrush thick and tangled beneath her boots. She called out, hoping to hear a response, to find someone, anyone, who might be near. But all that answered her was the echo of the baby's cry, growing louder with each step. Eventually, she came to a clearing. The trees parted, revealing a small, dark grove. In the center, there was a large stone that seemed oddly out of place, covered in moss and ivy. The cries were deafening now, filling the air around her, and she could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. She approached the stone cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of the source. But there was nothing, no baby, no person, just the unrelenting sound of a child crying. And then, as if on cue, the crying stopped. The sudden silence was more unsettling than the cries had been. Laura stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the hair on the back of her neck standing on end, as if someone, or something, was watching her. The air felt thick, charged, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. It was then that she heard it. Footsteps. At first, they were soft, barely audible, but they grew louder, closer. Someone, or something, was approaching her from behind. Laura turned quickly, but the clearing was empty. There was no one there. Her heart raced, panic setting in. She spun around, trying to find any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the trees, the stone, and the eerie stillness of the forest. She took a step back, her mind reeling. The cries had stopped, but the footsteps continued, now accompanied by a low, guttural whisper. And then, as if in answer to her unspoken fear, a voice echoed from the darkness of the trees, soft and almost pleading. "Help me. Please." Laura's breath caught in her throat, and her body froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice she had heard calling for help, but now, it was different. Distorted, twisted. Before she could react, the sound of heavy breathing filled the air. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the whispering turned into a low, guttural growl. Something was moving in the shadows. Without thinking, Laura turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the ground as she tore through the woods, not daring to look back. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in on her, and the cries of the baby followed her, growing louder with each passing second. But the deeper she ran, the more she realized that the cries were not coming from behind her. They were coming from everywhere. She stumbled, tripping over branches and rocks, the sound of the growling breath growing louder in her ears. Panic flooded her system, and she pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain in her legs and chest. She had to get out of the forest. She had to escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she burst out of the woods, her heart hammering in her chest. She found herself back on the familiar trail, the trees parting and giving way to the path leading out of the forest. The cries of the baby slowly faded into the distance, and the oppressive air seemed to lift. But as Laura reached the edge of the forest, she turned back for just a moment. And that's when she heard it. A soft, whispering voice, carried on the wind. "Help me. Please." The voice was so faint, so far away, but it was unmistakable. It was calling her. Laura's heart froze in her chest as she realized the truth. Whatever had been in that forest was not just a trick of the mind. The spirits of those who had vanished in the woods were trapped, eternally calling for help. And each time someone entered the forest, they would hear the cries, the voices, and the whispers of those lost to the trees. But it wasn't just the lost souls of the past who haunted Pine Grove. The forest had a way of claiming new victims. Laura's legs shook as she began to walk away, but deep down, she knew she wasn't free. The forest had heard her, and now, it would never let her go. Every time she closed her eyes, the haunting cries would follow her, calling, waiting, and watching.